They said a woman could lose her entire life to a story she never told. But what if every whispered version of her was wrong? What if the truth survived only in the fragments she left behind? Letters, glances, unfinished explanations? And what if two voices shaped her fate more than any action she ever took? Tonight, we return to the quiet rooms, where her reputation was rewritten without her. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand quietly inside a Tudor household and listen to the small exchanges that drifted through its rooms, it would become clear that a woman's reputation belonged less to her than to the voices around her. Reputation moved through these houses like a shared object. Lifted, handled, reshaped, until it no longer resembled the woman it described. It was carried in casual statements during morning routines, in restrained greetings at church, and in unspoken judgments exchanged with a single glance. A name could be polished or damaged in the space of a day, and the woman attached to it often had no chance to intervene. In this world, reputation was not a reflection of truth but a product of collective storytelling. People in Tudor society accepted this without surprise. They understood that a reputation was built from fragments, a look observed at the wrong moment, a rumour repeated without certainty, or a silence interpreted as agreement. Households protected their status with constant attention to appearances, training women to behave in ways that reassured outsiders. A wife's voice might be calm, her posture disciplined, her expressions muted, all to maintain a narrative that honoured the family's standing. These careful performances persisted even when tension simmered beneath the surface, because the outward image mattered far more than the reality within the walls. Families controlled public image with consistency and intention. A mother-in-law might quietly correct a wife's gestures, not out of concern for her behaviour, but to prevent misinterpretation by observers. When guests visited, the household presented itself as orderly and harmonious, using the wife's composure as proof of stability. Every movement, every response, became material for others to interpret. What onlookers believed shaped the woman's reputation far more effectively than anything she said about herself. She existed as both a person and a symbol, an individual whose identity was overshadowed by the expectations placed upon her. Silence played a powerful role in shaping this symbol. In Tudor society, silence could erase faults, but it could also invent them. When a woman stayed quiet, others filled the void with their own assumptions, moulding her character from incomplete information. Silence acted like editing. It removed details, softened edges, or concealed tensions that might have changed how others perceived her. A woman who avoided confrontation might be called modest or submissive. Another who hesitated to defend herself could be viewed as guilty. The same silence could carry entirely different meanings depending on who witnessed it. The public never saw the complexity of these situations. They saw only the surface. How a woman appeared during a procession, how she greeted others during gatherings, how she behaved in the presence of her husband. These observations accumulated slowly, forming a narrative accepted as truth even when it drifted far from her lived experience. Outsiders rarely questioned whether their interpretations were accurate. They merely added their impressions to the growing pool of stories that defined her. Inside the household, reputation hovered like a constant presence. Servants carried pieces of the narrative from room to room, intentionally or accidentally altering its shape. Their observations held weight because they witnessed daily life. Yet their words were filtered through hierarchy and fear. A servant might speak cautiously, knowing a misplaced comment could lead to punishment. Or they might reveal sensitive moments in whispered conversations with other households. Once set loose, these fragments spread quickly and took on a life of their own. A woman's reputation, therefore, became a collective construction, held by neighbours, relatives, or servants, churchgoers, and even strangers who had only glimpsed her once. The truth of her character mattered far less than how her actions were interpreted by others. A single misread expression could outweigh years of courteous behaviour. A moment of hesitation could become evidence of hidden flaws. And if the household needed someone to blame for tension or misfortune, the wife was often the easiest target. What made this structure particularly harsh was the lack of recourse. A Tudor woman could not easily correct a rumour without appearing defensive. She could not confront her critics without risking further damage. Her silence, meant to protect her, frequently strengthened the stories spoken about her. She lived at the mercy of collective perception, unable to reclaim ownership of her own name. Her identity, true, private, complex, remained hidden beneath a public version shaped by others. In a society that valued order, the reputation served as both constraint and weapon. It allowed families to maintain control, to reinforce social expectations, and to protect their lineage. At the same time, it left women vulnerable, requiring them to obey rules they had no hand in creating. Their lives unfolded under constant observation, each moment feeding a narrative they did not own. A woman might endure this system for decades without understanding how much of her story belonged not to her, but to everyone watching. The world just described reveals how a woman's identity could shift as others adjusted the story around her. Those adjustments are about to draw even tighter as legal authority begins to define her worth. And when that authority settles its judgment, the woman behind the role may appear in ways she never intended. Marriage in Tudor society offered a woman legitimacy that no other relationship could provide. Yet this legitimacy existed more on parchment than in lived experience. The law recognized her place in the household, recorded her status in contracts, and attached her name to property and lineage. These protections looked solid from a distance, but in daily life, they revealed their limits quickly. A wife might appear anchored by legal authority, yet the structure supporting her was built on obligations rather than understanding. Her worth was documented, but her emotional world remained untouched by the institutions surrounding her. The public viewed marriage as evidence of order. A married woman embodied stability, discipline, and continuity. People assumed she operated within the household's rules, contributing to a predictable rhythm others depended upon. This expectation alone shaped her identity more strongly than the vows she exchanged. As long as she met the visual demands of her role, appropriate clothing, measured speech, and respectful posture, society considered her proof that the household functioned properly. Her interior struggles were invisible and irrelevant to this broader perception. Lawmakers reinforced these expectations. The legal system cared primarily about property, inheritance, and moral structure. A wife served as the unit through which these matters were organized. Her presence secured legitimacy for children, protected lineage, and helped maintain clear boundaries of responsibility. But none of these protections reached the intimate corners of her daily life. The law could confirm her standing, yet it could not prevent her from being dismissed emotionally by the man who held authority within the home. Her legal position did not shield her from loneliness, manipulation, or gradual erasure. Because of this, a wife's authority often depended on how the husband chose to interpret her role. He could present her as respected or marginal, valued or tolerated. The same system that recognized her as the rightful woman of the household also allowed her voice to be overshadowed by his decisions, even when the law stood in her favor. Custom and expectation could dilute its effect. A husband who turned cold did not break the law. A husband who withheld confidence did not violate any statute. The distance between them could widen without producing any consequence, beyond whispered sympathy from those who noticed. This imbalance shaped daily interactions. In public spaces, a wife represented the household's moral discipline. In private spaces, she navigated emotional uncertainty with little support. Her legitimacy became a fixture that others admired while she struggled beneath its weight. The title wife imposed duties rather than comfort, requiring her to uphold standards that rarely reflected the real conditions of her life. People praised the security granted by marriage, but never questioned whether that security extended to the woman herself. The assumption that a lawful wife ensured household order created further pressure. Neighbors evaluated a family's harmony by observing its behavior. Her calmness, her predictability, and her reliability. Any strain she felt had to be concealed to preserve the public impression of stability. The burden of maintaining this appearance fell entirely on her. Even when the environment around her grew tense, she lived in a constant state of adjustment, refining her expressions, adjusting her tone, and measuring each gesture to meet expectations she never set. This role left little room for her emotional truth. Grief, doubt, or frustration had to be hidden, because acknowledging them risked altering how the community perceived not only her, but the entire household. The law protected her position, but social expectations transformed her into a symbol rather than a person. People spoke of her duty, not her needs. They admired her steadiness without asking what it cost. The more she fulfilled this symbolic function, the more invisible she became as an individual. Over time, the gap between legal protection and emotional vulnerability grew increasingly apparent. A wife might hold the highest female position within the household, yet she remained isolated in matters that affected her most deeply. She was expected to be the anchor that kept the family steady, even when she herself had no anchor to rely upon. Her legitimacy became both a shield and a cage, guarding her status while restricting her freedom to express anything that deviated from the accepted script. In this environment, marriage served as an institution of order, not of care. Society celebrated the stability it produced, while overlooking the quiet strain it imposed on the women tasked with upholding it. The law recognized the wife as essential, but recognition alone could not soften the reality of limited agency, emotional neglect, or the silent burdens she carried. She existed at the intersection of protection and vulnerability, praised for belonging while left alone within that belonging. Her position just described reveals how the law could secure her status while leaving her inner life untouched. Pressures within the household are tightening as unspoken judgments begin to shift the ground beneath her. And once whispers start reshaping her image, the distance between her real self and the one others believe in will grow sharply. Rumors in Tudor society moved with a speed that truth could never match. A single remark exchanged in a hallway or murmured across a courtyard could travel through households before the person mentioned had any chance to counter it. These whispers did not require certainty, they needed only repetition. Each time they shifted from one voice to another, they gained new detail, new confidence, and new purpose. What began as a vague suggestion slowly hardened into something people accepted without question. Once this happened, the woman at the center of the story found herself facing a version of her own image that she did not recognize. The fragility of reputation meant that even the smallest detail could change how others perceived her. A missed greeting, a tightened expression at the wrong moment, or a brief absence from a gathering. All could be interpreted as signs of deeper faults. Observers rarely paused to consider context. They relied instead on impressions that suited the narratives they already believed or wished to uphold. In this environment, a woman's intentions became irrelevant. What mattered was how others chose to describe her. And each descriptive fragment gained force as it circulated. Households played an active role in this process. Servants exchanged comments during their tasks, unaware of how their casual observations might expand once they left the room. Relatives repeated fragments of conversation without confirming their accuracy. Neighbors interpreted gestures based on their own expectations or frustrations. As these pieces accumulated, they formed a picture that differed from the woman's real behavior. She might conduct herself with consistency, but consistency had little power against the elasticity of rumor. Rumors did not spread because people sought harm. They spread because they filled the silence. In a society where information moved informally, the absence of clarity invited invention. When individuals lacked direct knowledge, they created explanations that felt plausible. These explanations, though born from speculation, quickly gained the authority of truth. Once they reached a certain number of voices, they became nearly impossible to dislodge. A woman could deny them, but denial often seemed like further proof of guilt. The speed at which these stories traveled revealed a deeper truth. Reputation was not built through personal effort, but through collective interpretation. The woman herself contributed only a fraction to the version of her that society accepted. The rest was crafted by observers who saw her from a distance. These observers shaped her identity through their own fears, assumptions, and desires. Even those who felt sympathy for her were capable of repeating altered versions of events without realizing how much weight their words carried. As whispers multiplied, perception shifted quietly. A woman who had once been seen as steady might suddenly be viewed as withdrawn. Another who had been admired for her restraint could be recast as cold or unfeeling. The adjustments were subtle at first. Small changes in tone when her name was mentioned. Slight pauses before responding to her presence. Over time, these small cues accumulated into a collective judgment. She might sense the shift long before she understood its cause, feeling the air around her tighten without knowing who had redirected it. The most unsettling aspect was how thoroughly these stories became detached from reality. A woman's actual actions mattered less than the story others found most convenient to repeat. Context disappeared. Nuance vanished. Her agency dissolved as the narrative solidified without her involvement. Even if she tried to correct misunderstandings, her efforts risked appearing defensive or manipulative. The rumor had already shaped her role. Her truth no longer carried the same weight as the circulating tale. Reputation thus depended entirely on the storyteller. A sympathetic voice could soften interpretations, while a hostile one could sharpen them beyond recognition. A single, influential individual, a mother-in-law, a respected neighbor, a senior servant, could tilt the entire perception of a household. Their version of events, retold with confidence, became the foundation upon which others built their assumptions. The woman at the center could only watch as her image shifted, altered by hands she could not see and choices she had no power to influence. What spread most easily were not facts, but impressions. People remembered tone more than content, posture more than circumstance. They preferred stories that aligned with what they already suspected. Rumors required no evidence, only interest. And because interest was plentiful in a tightly bound society, rumor thrived with little resistance. By the time truth attempted to surface, the audience for it had already moved on. For the woman being discussed, the consequences were immediate. She felt the change in how others greeted her, the hesitation in their voices, the careful distance in their movements. No one accused her openly. They simply behaved as though something about her had shifted. She lived in a space where perception shaped reality, and once perception turned against her, reclaiming her identity became an exhausting, often futile task. The shifts in her image reveal how the same moment can be interpreted in more than one direction. Two distinct perspectives are already forming, each assigning her a different place in the story. As these versions drift further apart, the question of whether she is harmed or empowered will no longer have a simple answer. The same event in a Tudor household could fracture into two entirely different interpretations, each shaped by the person who chose to speak about it. Facts held little authority on their own. They were filtered through emotion, loyalty, resentment, or private intention. What one witness viewed as a quiet gesture of restraint might be retold by another as evidence of disapproval. Nothing existed in a stable form. Every moment carried multiple lives, multiplying further as it passed through more voices. A wife could walk through her own home believing she understood what others had seen, only to discover later that the version circulating outside her hearing bore almost no resemblance to the truth she remembered. Within this shifting landscape, the wife occupied an uncertain role. The same action could cast her as a victim or as someone exerting subtle control. If she lowered her gaze, some interpreted it as modesty wounded by insult, while others read it as calculation. If she remained calm, observers debated whether her silence reflected dignity or quiet manipulation. Her intentions mattered less than the lens through which they were viewed. And that lens changed constantly, depending on who spoke first and who repeated it. Her place in the narrative became unstable. Dependent on forces she could neither predict nor influence. Dope, inside the household. Competing perspectives formed quickly. Servants who witnessed a moment of tension might describe it differently depending on whom they served. A mother-in-law might recount events in a way that protected family reputation, softening the husband's behavior and magnifying the wife's reactions. A sympathetic friend could frame the same encounter as evidence of unjust treatment. Each version contained fragments of truth, yet none represented the complete picture. These incomplete stories accumulated, widening the distance between how the wife experienced her life and how the world believed she lived it. The most unsettling part was that no single version could be declared entirely false. Each perspective captured a portion of reality, distorted by emotion or misunderstanding, but grounded in something that had genuinely occurred. This partial truth gave every account a sense of legitimacy, even when accounts contradicted one another. The wife found herself split across these competing interpretations, forced into roles that did not reflect the complexity of her experience. She became two different women at once, one shaped by sympathy, the other by suspicion. The gaps between these perspectives held the most power. What was left unsaid, what was forgotten, or what was assumed without evidence filled the space between the different narratives. These gaps created room for speculation, and speculation fed the social structure that thrived on uncertainty. Community members selected whichever version resonated most with their expectations or biases. Once chosen, that version settled into their minds as the truth, even if another version coexisted quietly beside it. By the time the narratives reached wider circles, the wife's role in the event had already been reshaped into something she could no longer recognize. She might hear her name spoken in tones that implied sorrow, or contempt, or admiration. The same moment could elevate her or diminish her, depending on who recounted it. People rarely questioned why multiple explanations existed. Instead, they accepted the version they found more compelling, unaware that another equally confident account existed elsewhere. This duality placed the wife in a constant state of exposure. She could not control how others chose to remember or retell what they saw. She could only observe the results, sensing that the ground beneath her identity had shifted without warning. Her life became a story told from the outside, shaped by conflicting interpretations that rarely included her own voice. She lived inside her experiences, yet outsiders authored the meaning of those experiences. What lay in the gaps between these accounts, those spaces where details blurred or disappeared, held the closest thing to truth, though no one sought it. People preferred certainty, even if it was built from incomplete understanding. They wanted a story that aligned neatly with their assumptions, not one that demanded patience or nuance. The wife, caught between these competing narratives, became both misunderstood and overdefined. She was too many things at once, and not enough of herself in any single account. In the end, a single event became a mirror with two faces. Observers chose which face to believe, and their choice shaped how she would be treated, spoken about, and judged. She lived under the weight of these stories, knowing that neither version fully captured her intentions. The truth remained somewhere in the empty spaces where no one bothered to look. This widening divide reveals how one moment can fracture into conflicting identities. Those identities are beginning to settle into the minds of observers, each reinforcing a story they prefer to believe. Once recognition begins to depend on the husband's voice, the balance of the narrative will shift again. The husband occupied a central place in the narrative of a Tudor household, not because he witnessed every moment, but because others looked to him to determine which version of events held authority. People repeated his interpretations with little question, trusting that his position granted him clarity. His voice guided the household's understanding of what had happened and why. Even when he spoke casually, his words carried the weight of a conclusion. Servants adjusted their retellings to match his tone. Relatives aligned their accounts with his assumptions. The story did not solidify until he acknowledged it. And once he did, alternative explanations quietly faded. This influence shaped how truth was constructed. When multiple perspectives existed, people deferred to the husband, expecting him to provide the most reasonable summary. His choices appeared objective, yet they were shaped by personal emotion and private frustration. A moment of impatience could make him describe his wife as distant. A surge of pride might lead him to portray her as composed. These shifts appeared logical on the surface, but they masked the underlying subjectivity that guided them. The household learned to treat his preferences as neutral, failing to recognize how much they reflected his inner state. This created a pattern in which partialities blended seamlessly with the appearance of reason. When the husband favored a particular narrative, others perceived it as an honest assessment rather than a personal inclination. His authority protected his interpretations from scrutiny. If he minimized tension, listeners accepted that harmony had been restored. If he expressed doubt, they concluded that the concern was justified. His emotional landscape shaped the story in ways he himself might not have recognized. The structure of Tudor society encouraged this dynamic, reinforcing the belief that domestic judgment rested naturally in his hands. The wife lived within this framework, watching her public image bend according to his changing responses. On days when he viewed her with sympathy, she appeared to others as steady and dignified. When he felt strained or resentful, observers sensed an undefined fault in her demeanor. These adjustments occurred quietly, transmitted through subtle changes in how he spoke her name or described her actions. People listened for cues in his tone, interpreting them as reliable signals of her character. She could behave with unwavering consistency, yet perception shifted based on emotions she did not cause and could not predict. Inside the household, this influence was unmistakable. Servants altered their behavior depending on the husband's mood, shaping their narratives to avoid conflict or gain favor. Relatives adopted his perspective to demonstrate unity, ignoring contradictions that might complicate the story. Even in moments where the wife's experience differed drastically from his account, her silence was expected. Correcting him would be seen as defiance. Ignoring him would be interpreted as guilt. She had no safe position from which to reclaim the version of herself that was slowly eroding under these accumulated interpretations. Over time, the husband's shifting emotions created a moving boundary around her identity. The wife did not know which version of herself others would encounter, one formed by a brief display of warmth or one distorted by an unspoken frustration. She sensed the instability through subtle changes in greetings, posture, and tone from those around her. The narrative that shaped her life had its center outside of her, anchored in someone whose perspective changed without warning. She became a figure whose image rose or fell based on a man's private state of mind. This imbalance left the wife increasingly vulnerable, even when she recognized that the stories told about her no longer resembled her own reality. She lacked a platform to correct them. The husband's voice overshadowed hers, not through force, but through expectation. Society believed he provided clarity, even when clarity was impossible. His authority created the illusion of accuracy. His presence alone discouraged contradiction. She existed in a world where her identity could shift dramatically, while she stood silently beside the person who unknowingly reshaped it. In this environment, the husband was not merely a participant in the household narrative, he was its anchor. His interpretations framed discussions, guided assumptions, and determined which version of events gained traction. Even when others privately doubted his perspective, they rarely challenged it. The social structure relied too heavily on his position to allow meaningful dissent. The wife, caught inside this system, could only endure the slow transformation of her public image as the household adjusted itself to match his evolving moods. The story of her life was authored in a voice that was not her own. These patterns reveal how easily the household aligned itself with the husband's chosen interpretation. That alignment is beginning to shape every conversation, every observation, and every expectation surrounding the wife. As voices beyond the marriage start influencing the narrative, the story surrounding her will expand in ways she cannot control. In Tudor households, a mistress existed outside the boundaries of formal authority, yet her emotional influence reached into places where official power could not operate. She did not hold a title, nor did she possess any recognized rights within the family structure, but her presence affected the atmosphere in ways that were quiet and persistent. People watched for subtle shifts in the husband's expression after he encountered her, noting the tension, restlessness, or softened composure that lingered. These small changes, observed repeatedly, created an aura around her that suggested significance even when she attempted to remain unobtrusive. Without official standing, her influence emerged through indirect paths. Servants carried fragments of what they witnessed. Brief exchanges, restrained gestures, hints of anxiety or hope that flickered across her face. These fragments rarely stayed contained. They transformed into whispers passed between tasks, growing slightly altered with each retelling. The mistress seldom spoke openly about her circumstances, but her silence encouraged others to construct narratives on her behalf. Those narratives, built on speculation and incomplete understanding, travelled quickly through the household. Her connection to the husband increased the weight of these stories. When he returned from meeting her, looking unsettled, observers assumed she had stirred some inner conflict. If he appeared unusually gentle or distracted, they attributed it to her as well. His emotional fluctuations became the household's reference point for interpreting her importance, even without speaking. She shaped the atmosphere through the reactions she evoked in him. The wife felt these shifts as well, not through confrontation, but through the subtle changes in how others watched her, measured their words, or reassessed their assumptions. Whispers surrounding the mistress developed in private corners rather than public rooms. No one claimed responsibility for starting them. They seemed to arise naturally from the tension embedded in the household's routines. People repeated them because they filled gaps in understanding, offering explanations for moments they could not clearly interpret. The mistress became a figure defined more by speculation than by action, her identity shaped by what others imagined she experienced. These impressions, once circulated, clung to her more tightly than any truth she might have offered. Sympathy played a complicated role in shaping how people spoke about her. Some believed she lived in emotional uncertainty, dependent on the affection of a man who could dismiss her at any moment. They viewed her as someone to be pitied, caught in a situation with no proper recognition or protection. Others interpreted that same vulnerability as calculated restraint, assuming she used quietness to generate compassion or influence. These competing interpretations created two versions of her, neither fully accurate, yet both convincing to those who endorsed them. Pity, once transformed into narrative, carried consequences for everyone involved. When observers favoured the mistress as a figure deserving compassion, they sometimes redirected blame toward the wife. imagining her as rigid or unfeeling. When they viewed the mistress with suspicion, they judged her harshly for motives she never expressed. In either case, the household's balance shifted. The mistress's presence, though unofficial, disrupted expectations and introduced ambiguity into roles that were otherwise rigid and hierarchical. Her precarity heightened this tension. She lived with the knowledge that her position lacked legitimacy, making each gesture susceptible to scrutiny and reinterpretation. She could influence emotion but not policy, atmosphere but not structure. A misplaced glance or a moment of hesitation became material for new rumors. Her silence, meant to preserve her safety, often carried more meaning than her words would have. She became a vessel into which others poured their assumptions, desires, or grievances, allowing her story to expand far beyond her control. In this environment, a mistress shaped the household narrative unintentionally. Her influence emerged from the emotional reactions she stirred and the imaginative stories others built around those reactions. These narratives seeped into perceptions of the wife, altering how people interpreted her behavior and how they spoke about her role. The mistress did not threaten the wife through overt action, but through the silent, cumulative force of interpretation, carried by voices that moved freely through the household. Such shifts reveal how a woman without formal standing could still redirect the emotional course of an entire household. Those redirections are beginning to blur the distinction between compassion and doubt, shaping how every gesture is read. With each retelling drifting further from its origin, the authority to define the wife is slipping toward those who speak from the margins. The husband's family held a powerful role in shaping how the wife was perceived, extending their influence far beyond the walls of the household. Their presence formed a quiet network of authority, determining what should be praised, excused, or condemned. Among them, the mother-in-law occupied a particularly significant position. Her words carried the weight of experience, age, and social expectation. People trusted her observations more readily than those of younger members, believing she had seen enough family cycles to judge behavior with clarity. Her evaluations, spoken or implied, guided how neighbors and relatives viewed the wife, often long before they witnessed her behavior themselves. This influence appeared in subtle ways: a slight adjustment to the wife's clothing, a restrained comment at a gathering, or a quiet sigh during a family dispute could shift interpretation without any direct accusation. Observers rarely questioned the mother-in-law's tone. They assumed her guidance reflected a desire to protect the family's stability. Even when her remarks emerged from personal disappointment or private frustration, listeners treated them as objective assessments. Her approval could elevate the wife in the eyes of the community. Her disapproval could narrow perceptions to a single, unflattering narrative. Extended relatives contributed to this process as well. Their loyalty rested with the family line, rather than the individual woman who had entered it. When tensions arose, they shaped stories in ways that preserved dignity for their side, choosing details that reinforced long-standing beliefs about order and propriety. A cousin might repeat a softened version of an uncomfortable moment, ensuring the husband appeared measured. An aunt might retell an argument by emphasizing the wife's tone, not the context that provoked it. These retellings spread outward, gaining shape with every repetition, bending the narrative to serve the interests of the family as a whole. Such stories traveled quickly because they aligned with existing expectations. People believed what seemed familiar. A narrative, portraying the husband's family as steady and principled, required little adjustment. Adding a minor fault to the wife's character did not disrupt the established framework. As the stories circulated, they blended into the public consciousness, becoming part of how the community understood the household. The wife's true behavior mattered less than the version curated by those around her. She lived in the center of a narrative authored by others. The collective priority of maintaining family honor intensified these patterns. Reputation in Tudor society attached itself to lineage, not individuals. A single misinterpretation could be dismissed, but a sequence of stories suggesting instability threatened the family's broader standing. In response, relatives adjusted their narratives to protect their name. This often meant smoothing over the husband's missteps while magnifying moments that cast doubt on the wife. They did not frame these actions as unkind, they framed them as necessary. Preserving dignity required reinforcing a version of events that favored continuity, even if the cost was borne by one person. Inside the household, the wife felt these pressures acutely. She noticed the controlled politeness during meals, the careful phrasing used when family members asked about her day, the measured scrutiny in their glances. These interactions did not accuse her directly, yet they revealed that her image had already been shaped elsewhere. She lived inside a structure where affection could not protect her from expectation. The relatives believed they were safeguarding the family by guiding how she should be seen, even when their guidance tightened around her like a quiet restraint. Her efforts to present herself with composure often met mixed interpretations. When she remained calm during disagreement, some relatives saw it as a sign of respect. Others interpreted it as emotional detachment. When she tried to demonstrate diligence, they questioned whether she acted from sincerity or obligation. Each gesture entered a narrative already in motion, altered by the voices that carried it. The wife's role, though central to the functioning of the household, remained secondary in the formation of its public story. These dynamics created a space where the wife could not fully reclaim her identity. The mother-in-law's authority, the relatives' loyalty, and the community's expectations formed a barrier between intention and interpretation. Even when the wife behaved with consistency and restraint, her story belonged to those who found meaning in the fragments they chose to repeat. The household's honor overshadowed her individual experience, reducing her complexity into simplified impressions that served a larger purpose. In this environment, her reputation became a family asset rather than a reflection of her character. How she was perceived mattered only if it supported the family's standing. Her voice held little influence compared to the collective weight of those who spoke for her. She lived under a network of narratives shaped by people who believed they understood her role better than she did herself. Her identity blurred into their expectations, leaving her reflection in society's eyes, shaped more by lineage and loyalty than by truth. The wife is watching her own story drift farther from her hands, reshaped by the voices that surround her. Every gesture she makes is entering a world where others decide what it means, turning even the smallest movement into evidence of something larger. Silence now sits in the space she cannot fill, treated as confirmation by those who have already decided how she should be understood. A shift in perception had begun to take shape around the wife, gradually separating her lived reality from the version of her being repeated throughout the household. Conversations carried fragments of her behavior, often stripped of context, and these fragments traveled faster than any explanation she might have offered. Over time, she noticed that her intentions no longer guided how others understood her. Instead, the meaning of her words and actions depended on those who repeated them, adjusted them, or interpreted them according to their own assumptions. What once felt familiar now seemed distant, as though she were watching someone else's life being described in her place. Control over her own story slipped quietly from her hands. When she tried to speak plainly, listeners heard tones that were not there. When she remained calm, they spoke of emotional coldness. A moment of hesitation became a sign of internal conflict. Even her most ordinary choices drew attention, not for what they were, but for what others decided they implied. She found herself living under a form of scrutiny that never announced itself out loud, yet shaped every conclusion drawn about her. The household no longer responded to her actions directly, it responded to the interpretations surrounding those actions. This shift intensified as every gesture, however small, was met with quiet evaluation, a pause before responding to a question, a glance at a passing servant, an early retreat from an evening gathering. Each moment entered a network of commentary that grew larger without her participation. People repeated what they believed they saw, not what she experienced. Those retellings made her presence feel thinner, as though an invisible version of her was moving ahead of her, influencing perceptions before she had the chance to speak for herself. Her identity became something built out of whispers rather than conversations. Attempts to correct misunderstandings rarely changed the direction of these impressions. When she tried to clarify her intentions, listeners focused more on why she felt the need to clarify. When she refrained from responding, they viewed her silence as confirmation. No choice restored balance. Every action fed into a narrative already in progress. She discovered that the explanation did not repair anything. It only created new speculation. The more she tried to remain steady, the more people searched for signs beneath her steadiness. Convinced that neutrality concealed something worth uncovering, silence soon became one of the heaviest burdens she carried. People around her interpreted the absence of speech more forcefully than any statement she could have made. When she chose to listen instead of offering an opinion, observers assumed reluctance or hidden resentment. When she attempted to maintain peace by avoiding unnecessary conflict, they perceived her avoidance. Silence, once a place of protection, became a source of suspicion. It allowed others to fill the space with whatever explanation suited their expectations. In that emptiness, her voice lost ground to those who spoke more frequently and with greater confidence. Gradually, she realized that she lived in two overlapping narratives, the one she understood internally and the one created by those who talked about her. These narratives rarely aligned. She felt the gap widening each time a retold story reached her ears, altered in subtle ways that made her seem unfamiliar even to herself. In a household where reputation carried as much weight as duty, such distortions settled deeply. People around her did not intend cruelty. They simply believed the version of her that had been repeated the most. Frequency replaced accuracy. Repetition replaced truth. Her attempts to navigate this environment required constant calculation. Every gesture had to be considered, every word measured, every reaction restrained. She learned to anticipate the possible interpretations of her actions before she made them. Yet even this caution did not restore her agency. Instead, it reminded her of how thoroughly others had taken possession of her image. The household no longer responded to her presence, but to the narrative attached to it. She became a figure shaped by distant observation, rather than direct understanding. A reputation formed under these conditions gained momentum independent of its origin. Once others accepted a certain view of her, they found ways to reinforce it through daily interactions. A sympathetic smile from one relative became an opportunity to question her emotional state. A polite refusal of assistance became a sign of pride. Ordinary behavior rarely remained ordinary. Her image transformed into something maintained by people who believed they were preserving order within the household. Their intentions mattered less than the effect. Her role shrank. Her voice softened, and her truth receded into a space no one asked about. By this point, she understood that reclaiming her reputation would require more than steady behavior or quiet endurance. It would require an audience willing to reconsider their assumptions, and that was a luxury she did not possess. Those around her had already woven her into a story that served their understanding of the family. Changing that story would mean asking them to question their own certainty, and few were prepared to do so. She stood inside a narrative shaped by others, unable to step outside it long enough to correct the record. Her story is drifting further from her control as interpretations continue to multiply around her. Each gesture she makes now enters a space where meaning is assigned before she can speak for herself. New observers will soon join this process, adding layers she never intended and carrying her reputation into directions she cannot predict. Servants occupied a peculiar position within the household, moving through spaces where conversations shifted tone the moment they entered and resumed once they left. They witnessed more than anyone acknowledged, not because they sought information, but because their duties placed them at the edges of every room. Their presence was constant yet unspoken, familiar yet overlooked. People did not guard their expressions or gestures in front of them, believing that a servant's voice held no power outside the tasks assigned. This assumption allowed the servants to observe the changes surrounding the wife long before those changes became apparent to her. They saw the silences during meals, the way glances travelled across the table, the moments when a relative paused before responding to the wife as though recalibrating their impression of her. Servants also noticed how quickly doors closed when they approached with trays or linens, and how conversations resumed in slightly different tones after they stepped away. These patterns formed a quiet map of shifting alliances within the household. Yet, despite witnessing these developments, servants could not speak openly about what they saw. Their survival depended on appearing neutral, reliable, and forgettable. The lack of a public voice did not mean they lacked understanding. Servants recognized the difference between a genuine misunderstanding and a deliberate misrepresentation. They saw how a single comment, stripped of nuance, was retold in the corridor by someone wishing to justify their own view. They observed how pieces of information travelled upward, changing tone as they passed through different hands, filtered by personal loyalties or household expectations. A servant might hear one version of a dispute while preparing a chamber, and another version while tending to a fire in a separate room. Each version carried its own purpose, shaping perceptions long before the wife had any chance to respond. Information rarely moved outward in its raw form. Those who carried it selected the details that aligned with their preferences or reinforced existing assumptions. A remark made in passing became a sign of resentment. A moment of quiet became evidence of emotional instability. Servants handed these fragments to the people above them, not out of malice, but because the structure of the household demanded compliance. They were expected to be useful, and usefulness often took the form of confirming what the listener already believed. Over time, these selective retellings created a narrative far removed from what the servants had actually witnessed. The danger of a single misinterpreted moment became increasingly clear. A comment misunderstood by one observer might reach another as a confession. A tense silence might be repeated as an argument. A brief exchange between the wife and a relative could be reshaped into a story that justified further scrutiny. Servants knew how easily reputations shifted under the weight of one inaccurately conveyed detail. They had seen this happen in other households, where a misplaced word changed the course of a woman's standing. In this household, they recognized the same pattern forming, though they lacked the authority to intervene. Their understanding did not protect them from the consequences of speech. A servant who repeated an unapproved version of events risked being accused of disloyalty. One who contradicted a favored relative risked dismissal. The household depended on the illusion that servants observed nothing and remembered nothing. Even though everyone relied on their quiet efficiency, servants learned to control their expressions carefully, to avoid being seen as taking sides. They maintained an appearance of detachment even when they sensed that the wife was steadily losing control over her story. Behind this restraint lay a complex awareness. Servants recognized that the wife faced a shifting landscape of interpretation. They saw how her actions were reframed through the voices of relatives, and how those reframings spread outward into the community. They understood that she was responding to pressures she could not fully name. Servants felt a muted sympathy for her, though they knew such feelings changed nothing. Their position allowed them to witness the slow erosion of her agency, but not to comment on it. Their silence was both expected and enforced. In the spaces where servants moved, corridors, stairwells, rooms left momentarily empty, they exchanged quiet remarks with one another. These conversations rarely carried judgment. They were acknowledgements of the tension that had begun to saturate the household. Servants shared what they had seen, compared their impressions, and recognized the discrepancies between truth and rumor. Yet even among themselves, caution remained. A misheard word could be repeated accidentally, shifting its path into the hands of someone who might use it for their own advantage. Information travelled unpredictably, reshaped by motives the servants could not always discern. Despite witnessing the wife's gradual loss of control over her reputation, servants remained bound by the structure that kept them silent. Their knowledge existed in a separate, unspoken layer of the household, accurate but inaccessible to those who needed it most. They carried the truth in fragments, aware that it could not be offered without consequence. Their silence allowed the official narrative to grow stronger, supported by retellings that departed further from the events they themselves had observed. They knew that a single incorrect detail, once repeated by the wrong person, could redirect the entire perception of the wife. By the time the wife sensed how deeply the narrative had shifted, the servants had already watched it unfold piece by piece. They saw the distance forming between who she was and who others believed her to be. They recognized the point at which the story had gained momentum beyond anyone's control. Yet they remained where they had always been, visible but unheard, knowledgeable but constrained, present in every room but excluded from every decision shaped by the stories circulating through the house. Their silence holds the truest version of what has unfolded around her, though it remains sealed behind the hierarchy that governs their lives. Each filtered retelling continues to strip away the accuracy they alone possess, sending new distortions into the household. Further shifts will emerge as others begin using these distortions to justify actions that have not yet been spoken aloud. Efforts to preserve her image required the wife to navigate the household with a kind of deliberate restraint that did not draw attention, yet remained visible enough to counter the shifting narratives surrounding her. She understood that confrontation would only reinforce the unfavorable impressions already spreading through private discussions. Instead, she relied on steady composure in public settings, presenting herself with measured calm that signaled stability without appearing rigid. This composure became a form of defense, one that allowed her to maintain dignity even as interpretations worked against her. People expected a certain level of poise from her, and she leaned into that expectation carefully, knowing that missteps could deepen the doubts forming around her. Her behavior in communal spaces reflected this strategy. During meals, gatherings, and religious observances within the household, she kept her voice even and her expression steady. She avoided reacting sharply to subtle provocations, recognizing that emotional outbursts, no matter how justified, would weaken her position. Observers noted her restraint, though they interpreted it in different ways. Some saw it as an effort to preserve order. Others described it as detachment. Regardless of interpretation, her consistency allowed her to maintain a small measure of control over how she was perceived, even if she could not dictate the narrative itself. Maintaining calm was not a passive act. It required continuous awareness of the household's shifting tensions. She recognized that every room carried its own expectations, shaped by the roles of those within it. When relatives watched her closely, she adapted her tone to avoid appearing confrontational. When servants entered the space, she maintained her composure to prevent her emotions from becoming material for whispered conversations later in the day. Her restraint served as a quiet assertion of her character amid a network of observers who interpreted every gesture. It did not silence the rumors, but it prevented them from gaining additional strength through visible reaction. Beyond her demeanor in public spaces, the wife also relied on the roles assigned to her by the broader expectations of Tudor society. Religious participation offered one of the few avenues where her presence carried inherent credibility. She attended services consistently, contributed to devotional activities, and fulfilled duties related to household piety. These actions reinforced an image of moral stability, one that could counterbalance the more unfavorable interpretations circulating among relatives. In these settings, she existed within a framework that defined her behavior as virtuous by default, providing her with a buffer against the narratives forming beyond her control. Charitable involvement served a similar purpose. She supported small acts of generosity toward the poor, organized supplies for local needs, and offered assistance to anyone within the household facing illness or difficulty. These gestures were quiet rather than grand, but they spread outward through the community. People repeated such acts in their conversations, and these retellings provided a contrast to the household rumors. Her involvement in charity also positioned her as someone invested in the well-being of others, making it harder for detractors to present her as unstable or disruptive. Public virtue, even when subtle, held weight in shaping broader perceptions. These efforts did not eliminate the scrutiny she faced, but they allowed her to construct a parallel image that coexisted with the harsher interpretations circulating behind closed doors. She recognized that she could not silence every critic or redirect every retelling. Instead, she focused on building a version of herself that others could witness directly, without relying on the interpretations of intermediaries. Religious and charitable roles gave her a space where her actions were seen without distortion, offering her a rare opportunity to influence perception in a way that aligned with her intentions. In addition to these public-facing strategies, the wife began cultivating a quiet network of supporters. These individuals were not outspoken allies. They were people who observed her behavior long enough to form their own conclusions. Some were relatives who remained neutral in family conflicts. Others were members of the household staff who, despite their limited voices, carried impressions of her into the community through their daily interactions. And there were acquaintances outside the household, people who had met her during religious services or charitable work, who shared their positive impressions when the opportunity arose. Her network grew, not through persuasion, but through consistency. Those who supported her did so because they had seen enough to question the rumors on their own. She never asked them to defend her publicly. She understood the risks such actions posed. Instead, she trusted that their observations would circulate naturally in conversations, balancing the harsher versions of her story. These supporters did not alter the broader narrative outright, but they created pockets of resistance to it. Their voices offered a counterweight, small but steady, to the interpretations that attempted to diminish her. The limitations of her position remained clear. Her strategies required patience, restraint, and careful judgment. They did not provide immediate relief from the pressures she faced, nor did they restore full control over her reputation, but they allowed her to maintain a sense of integrity within an environment shaped by assumptions and shifting loyalties. She preserved her image not by challenging the narrative head-on, but by grounding her behavior in roles that others respected, even when they questioned her in private. Her actions created a subtle form of resilience within the household. People began noticing that the narratives surrounding her did not align neatly with what they observed firsthand. Some whispered less frequently. Others hesitated before repeating negative claims. Her consistency did not erase the rumors, but it introduced doubt into the spaces where they once grew unchecked. By grounding her reputation in observable actions, she created a foundation that remained stable even as the stories around her shifted unpredictably. These methods reveal how she has begun building a quieter form of influence within the household. Every act of restraint or public duty is slowly shaping a version of her that cannot be dismissed easily. Additional strategies will emerge as she learns which relationships can support her and which may work quietly against her. Gentleness had once been considered one of the wife's strengths, a quality that aligned with the expectations placed upon her when she first entered the household. Over time, however, the atmosphere around her changed in ways that made this same quality appear uncertain, even suspicious. People began interpreting her patience not as measured restraint, but as an inability to assert herself. They spoke quietly of how she allowed others to talk over her, how she responded to tension with calm, and how she rarely pushed back when confronted with criticism. What had once been admired now became a detail used to question her stability. Her endurance in difficult moments was similarly reinterpreted. When she tolerated unfair remarks or accepted decisions made without her input, observers concluded that she lacked conviction. They did not consider the broader pressures shaping her responses. They did not see that speaking sharply would have confirmed the very accusations circulating about her temperament. Instead, they focused on her silence as though it revealed something essential. The patience she showed to preserve peace became evidence to others that she was simply too passive to defend herself. Acts of generosity suffered the same fate. Small gestures she offered, helping a relative with a task, easing tension during a disagreement, or supporting someone who had ignored her earlier, were rarely acknowledged for what they were. People accepted her kindness, but viewed it through the lens of convenience. They assumed she behaved this way because she lacked alternatives, not because she chose to. Her capacity for forgiveness did not spark gratitude. It fueled the belief that she could be pushed aside without consequence. Those who benefited from her tolerance rarely defended her when others questioned her role. Even the moments when she tried to show warmth were often misunderstood. A soft reply was interpreted as uncertainty. A composed expression was seen as indifference. A decision to step back from conflict was treated as avoidance. She found herself trapped between the expectations placed upon her and the interpretations that twisted those expectations into weaknesses. The more gentle she became, the more others believed she lacked strength. The more she tried to remain steady, the more they spoke of fragility. Silence became one of the most difficult elements of her reputation to manage. She used it to diffuse tension, to prevent arguments from escalating, and to protect herself from accusations that might arise if she spoke too directly. But others filled that silence with their own conclusions. They speculated about her thoughts, her emotions, and her motives, turning absence into meaning. A pause became an admission. A lowered gaze became evidence of insecurity. A moment alone became a sign she was struggling to maintain composure. She did not explain because any attempt to correct these assumptions would only create new ones. Over time, these misreadings shaped a version of her that differed sharply from the woman she understood herself to be. In private, her restraint came from calculation rather than fear. Her gentleness was intentional, not automatic. Her silence served as protection against voices that sought to reshape her image. Yet no one saw this internal logic. They saw only the external behavior. Soft, careful, measured, and concluded that she lacked influence. Her true strength remained invisible inside a structure that demanded gentleness, yet dismissed it when shown consistently. She realized that she was being evaluated not on her actions, but on how those actions were perceived through the lens of family expectations. People expected women to be patient, but too much patience suggested weakness. They expected composure, but too much composure suggested emotional distance. They expected kindness, but too much kindness suggested submission. Her attempts to meet these expectations created a narrow boundary in which any movement, however slight, shifted interpretations in ways she could not predict. These pressures gradually reshaped the way she carried herself. She became more aware of how her tone might be recorded in memory, how her gestures might be repeated in conversation, and how her behavior might be compared to the narrative surrounding her. She understood that she could not abandon her gentleness entirely, nor could she rely on it to communicate her intentions clearly. Instead, she learned to move within the household with a careful balance. Present, but not exposed. Visible, but not vulnerable. Her restraint did not shield her from judgment, but it allowed her to endure it without giving critics additional evidence to use against her. Her isolation deepened as assumptions grew heavier. People rarely asked her how she felt. They spoke about her instead. They created explanations that suited their understanding of the household, ignoring the possibility that her gentleness concealed strength rather than weakness. In this environment, she carried the weight of being misunderstood by those who believed they understood her best. Her intentions are steadily overshadowed by interpretations that distort what she offers with sincerity. Each quiet gesture now creates more speculation than clarity, feeding a story she never agreed to. Further complications will arise as people begin shaping her reactions into evidence for conclusions they have not yet spoken aloud. Tension grew steadily around the wife's situation, as different versions of her story began circulating through the household and beyond. These versions did not arise from the events themselves, but from the voices interpreting those events. Each voice carried its own motive, its own perspective, and its own loyalty. Observers listened to these competing narratives, not because they sought truth, but because they gravitated toward whichever explanation aligned with their expectations or reinforced their feelings about the people involved. In this atmosphere, the wife faced a challenge no action of hers could directly counter. Her story was no longer her own to shape. The first voice came from the wife herself, though it reached others only in fragments. Her attempts to explain her actions or express her emotions rarely travelled far. When she softened her tone to avoid conflict, people saw vulnerability rather than intention. When she spoke with restraint, listeners interpreted tension rather than clarity. Her perspective surfaced mainly in the moments when she struggled to maintain steadiness, when her eyes lowered under the weight of misunderstanding, or when fatigue shaped her posture. These quiet signals were received as emotional unraveling, rather than as the controlled endurance she intended. Her truth, carried softly and cautiously, moved outward in weakened form. Opposite her stood a second voice, stronger, more confident, and far more likely to be repeated. This voice came from those who held authority in the household. Their words reached corners she could not access, and their interpretations carried weight simply because they came from positions of power. When they described her behavior, people treated those descriptions as impartial assessments. Even when the tone revealed irritation or bias, listeners overlooked it in favor of the assumed credibility of the speaker. The wife's perspective, however carefully expressed, rarely competed successfully with a version shaped by someone the community viewed as reliable or commanding. These two voices, one quiet, the other firm, framed the conflict surrounding her reputation. The wife's emotional expression, often subdued, was used to portray her as overwhelmed or unstable. Meanwhile, the authoritative voice cast her actions in a narrative that justified broader concerns or reinforced existing assumptions. People listening to both sides gravitated toward the interpretation that felt more coherent, and coherence usually favored the voice that spoke with confidence rather than caution. Authority shaped understanding long before empathy had the chance to intervene. Observers outside the immediate household played a significant role as well. Neighbors, distant relatives, and acquaintances heard these versions second-hand. They listened selectively, holding on to the parts that resonated with their beliefs about marriage, duty, and propriety. When they encountered contradictions, they resolved them not through inquiry but through preference. They believed what they wanted to believe, often in alignment with the more assertive voice. The wife's emotional expression, carried outward as a whisper, could not compete with the organized certainty projected by those above her. Over time, people developed conclusions without ever hearing the wife directly. They repeated the stronger version of events, assuming that authority equaled accuracy. Her silence, intended to protect her from misinterpretation, only allowed the louder voice to dominate further. The household became a place where her intentions were overshadowed by interpretations, offered confidently and repeated without scrutiny. Her efforts to remain composed were overshadowed by the narrative that portrayed her as fragile. Her endurance was overshadowed by claims that she struggled to maintain order. Each version of the story drifted farther from who she understood herself to be. The competing voices shaped not only her reputation, but also her relationships. People approached her differently depending on which version of the story they believed. Some treated her with excessive sympathy, assuming she was overwhelmed. Others kept their distance, convinced she was the cause of tension within the household. Few sought to understand her directly. The contrast between emotional expression and authoritative interpretation created a divide that she could not bridge alone. She moved through the household with the awareness that her presence now carried meanings assigned by others. As these narratives spread further, the original events that sparked them lost their importance. The interpretations became the story. People valued the version that affirmed their expectations more than the one that reflected the wife's lived experience. She recognized that her attempts to influence perception were limited, not by her behavior, but by the audience's willingness to hear her. Those who repeated the stronger voice felt no obligation to represent her fairly. They simply aligned with the certainty offered to them. This imbalance revealed how quickly a story could shift when two voices competed for control. The softer voice struggled to be heard. The stronger voice shaped conclusions. The community listened not for truth, but for confirmation of what they already believed. Two interpretations now hold more influence than anything she might say for herself. Every listener has begun choosing which version of the story fits their expectations, regardless of how events truly unfolded. Additional divisions will form as these interpretations spread outward, giving her less space to recover her own voice. Public appearance became one of the few areas where the wife could shape perception without depending on the interpretations of relatives or the silence of servants. In a household where rumors circulated freely and conclusions formed quickly, the way she presented herself carried more weight than any explanation she might offer. People watched closely for signs of instability or conflict, yet they also responded to signals of composure, confidence, and dignity. Clothing, posture, movement. Each detail shaped how her presence was understood. She learned to approach public spaces with a deliberate awareness of how easily impressions could spread. Her clothing choices reflected this strategy. When she appeared in garments that were neither extravagant nor neglected, observers interpreted steadiness rather than excess or decline. Colors were chosen with care, avoiding tones that suggested emotional strain, while also avoiding anything that might be seen as overly assertive. The smallest details, how her sleeves were arranged, how her collar sat, how well her gown was maintained, conveyed messages more clearly than spoken words. In a household that read meaning into everything she did, these careful choices helped counter the narratives that painted her as fragile or overwhelmed. Gestures and posture played a similar role. The way she carried herself across the hall, the way she lowered herself into a chair, the way her hands remained still rather than restless. These actions projected control, even when she felt none. People observed her movements to confirm their suspicions, but they also reacted to signs of stability when they saw them. A calm nod, a steady gaze, and a measured pause before speaking all contributed to a public image that resisted the stories forming around her. She did not attempt to appear cheerful or expressive. Such attempts risked seeming artificial. Instead, she remained composed in a way that could not easily be misinterpreted. Her influence grew stronger during significant gatherings. These were the moments when relatives, acquaintances, and even neighbors shared the same space, carrying their own assumptions and expectations. A single well-timed entrance could shift the tone of a room. When she appeared at an important moment, during a family discussion, a religious service, or a public meal, people took note. They observed not only her presence, but the manner in which she entered the scene, walking with a steady pace, acknowledging others with subtle clarity. She demonstrated that she had not withdrawn from her responsibilities. Her presence reminded observers that she remained central to the household despite the narrative circulating about her. These appearances did not erase suspicion entirely, but they introduced hesitation into the judgments people formed. When witnesses saw her behave consistently, they reconsidered the rumors they had heard. The disconnect between the stories and the woman standing before them created uncertainty. A relative who had repeated doubts about her stability might sit quietly after seeing her conduct herself with calm. A neighbor who had heard suggestions of discord might question whether those stories were incomplete. Such moments did not create vocal support, but they weakened the confidence with which others repeated unfavorable interpretations. Public image held power precisely because it could bypass the household's internal network of filtered information. People trusted what they witnessed directly, even when those observations conflicted with stories they had heard earlier. Over time, these first-hand impressions spread in their own way, forming a countercurrent to the dominant narrative. Her image became a point of reference, something stable that observers could recall when confronted with new rumors. Those who had seen her composed at difficult moments became less willing to accept exaggerated claims about her behavior. Her actions were subtle, but they altered the rhythm of the conversation surrounding her. When people spoke about her after seeing her in public, they used different terms: calm, steady, and present. These words lacked the dramatic force of the rumors, but carried quiet influence. They planted doubt where before there had been certainty. They shifted tone in discussions that had once leaned heavily against her. In this way, her public image served as a quiet form of resistance, offering a version of her that could not be easily overwritten. She understood that the power of image did not come from grandeur, but from consistency. Every appearance reinforced the version of herself she wished others to see, a woman capable of maintaining dignity in an environment that often challenged it. Her actions did not need to be dramatic, they needed only to be steady. Through this steadiness, she shaped a perception that moved beyond the narratives crafted by others. Her deliberate presence is beginning to interrupt the assumptions that once shaped every discussion about her. Each public moment adds a layer of clarity that observers cannot dismiss as easily as whispered claims. Further opportunities will appear as her behavior continues to challenge the version of her that others have tried to define. Attention within the household began shifting in a way that placed the wife at the center of new and harsher interpretations. Actions that once seemed ordinary took on a different tone when retold by others. People who had previously viewed her with neutrality now watched her with a quiet expectation, as though waiting for confirmation of the stories circulating about her. The smallest reactions were magnified. A glance, a tightened breath, or a firm word became evidence used to reinforce the claim that she had become unstable or difficult. She felt the weight of these reinterpretations pressing in from every direction. Jealousy was one of the first traits attributed to her. Any moment of discomfort she expressed was repeated with emphasis, while the context surrounding it faded. If she spoke more sharply than usual, someone remarked that she seemed threatened. If she withdrew from a conversation, another concluded that she could not tolerate competition. Even when she remained silent, observers described tension in her expression as proof of jealousy. People preferred this explanation because it aligned with the growing narrative that she could not manage her emotions. The exaggerations spread quickly, carried by those who found it easier to repeat assumptions than to understand her circumstances. Her firmness faced similar distortion. When she attempted to assert herself in discussions that affected her directly, listeners treated her tone as excessive. A single insistence on fairness became an accusation of controlling behavior. A refusal to accept an unreasonable decision became a sign of dominance. The authority she exercised in maintaining her household duties was reframed as rigidity, while the decisiveness she showed in difficult moments was portrayed as an attempt to command those around her. People no longer distinguished between strength and severity. They heard only what they expected to hear, a woman stepping beyond the role they believed she should occupy. This shift grew sharper as people began describing her reactions in terms that questioned her entire character. Her discomfort in uncomfortable moments was framed as an unpredictable emotion. Her desire for clarity was interpreted as suspicion. Her attempts to correct misunderstandings were viewed as hostile. Each action, however mild, found its way into conversations that stripped it of nuance. The household began using her as a point of reference in discussions about disorder, implying that her presence contributed to tensions rather than responding to them. She became a symbol used to justify the unease others felt, even when she played no role in creating it. Resistance, no matter how measured, invited even harsher judgment. If she pushed back gently against an unfair assumption, people described her as unbalanced. If she confronted an inaccurate retelling of an event, they treated her correction as an emotional outbreak. The line between reasonable self-defense and disruptive behavior collapsed in the eyes of those who had accepted the negative narrative. Her refusal to accept distorted claims threatened the structure that these stories supported, and so her resistance was recast as instability. People spoke about her not as someone reacting to pressure, but as someone creating it. This transformation into a symbol affected her daily life. She felt the shift in the way relatives addressed her, choosing their words carefully as though anticipating conflict. She saw it in the way servants observed her, cautious not to misinterpret her instructions. She noticed it in public spaces, when acquaintances looked at her with polite restraint instead of openness. Even when she behaved with complete composure, the expectations surrounding her created an atmosphere where her actions were judged before they were understood. She lived under a narrative that predated every gesture she made. Her attempts to counter this image met resistance. People dismissed her explanations, claiming she was overly defensive. They overlooked her calm, insisting she masked deeper turmoil. They ignored her consistency, focusing instead on moments retold inaccurately through whispers. Each clarification she offered seemed to strengthen the belief that she was trying too hard to control how others saw her. She realized that she had been placed in a position where interpretation mattered more than truth, and perception mattered more than fairness. Over time, the narrative solidified into something people discussed without hesitation. They no longer needed events to support their claims. They relied on the symbol she had become. The wife's reputation now functioned as a tool, shaped by those who found it useful to blame her for tensions they did not want to confront directly. She recognized that her struggle was no longer against individuals, but against a role others had written for her, one that overshadowed her intentions and reduced her identity to a simplified version of events. Her reactions are now interpreted through assumptions that grow stronger each time they are repeated. Every effort to restore balance deepens the belief that she is losing control, regardless of how steady she remains. New pressures will appear as others begin using her altered image to justify decisions they were already preparing to make. Efforts to reshape her reputation required the wife to act in ways that bypassed the narratives circulating about her. She understood that explanations alone would not be enough to alter the opinions already forming within the household and beyond it. Words were easily reshaped, retold, or ignored. Actions, however, left traces that observers could not dismiss as readily. She began choosing steps that reflected stability, duty, and commitment to roles the community valued. These steps offered her a quiet path toward rebuilding an image that had been weakened by rumor and assumption. Religious involvement became one of her most effective tools. She attended services consistently, taking her place with composure and participating with steady devotion. People watched her carefully in these moments, expecting signs of emotional strain or inconsistency. Instead, they saw a measured routine. Her presence in religious settings suggested reliability, and her quiet participation signaled a sense of order that contradicted the idea of instability spreading through whispers. She contributed to devotional duties within the household as well, preparing offerings, assisting with seasonal observances, and supporting clerical visitors. These actions formed a pattern that observers could not easily question. Her involvement extended beyond mere attendance. When members of the community faced illness or hardship, she offered support through prayer gatherings or simple acts of assistance. People connected these gestures to her character rather than to the stories circulating about her. Religious duty held a respected place in Tudor society, and those who fulfilled it were viewed through a lens of dignity. Her investment in these roles added weight to her presence, making it harder for detractors to present her as disruptive or unreliable. Beyond religious contributions, she sought ways to support artistic or educational pursuits associated with the household. These forms of patronage were subtle but meaningful. She commissioned small works that reflected the family's values, encouraged music lessons for younger relatives, or ensured that household members had access to tools that aided their learning. These contributions were not grand enough to appear strategic, yet they reached others through quiet acknowledgement. People repeated her involvement not as a rumor, but as an observation. Such acts demonstrated foresight and a sense of responsibility, traits that countered claims of emotional instability or excessive jealousy. Her support of the arts also altered how others perceived her influence within the household. By enabling cultural or educational activities, she created an environment that felt calmer and more structured. Relatives who once questioned her reactions began associating her presence with improvement rather than tension. Even those who distrusted her found themselves recognizing the tangible benefits of her contributions. These acknowledgements rarely took the form of gratitude, but they softened the tone in conversations about her. A person who supported the intellectual and spiritual growth of the household seemed less likely to embody the negative traits being circulated. Alongside these efforts, she cultivated a public image centered on responsibility. This did not require loud declarations or dramatic actions. It depended instead on consistency in daily behavior. She managed her duties methodically, maintained order in her personal spaces, and ensured that tasks were completed without drawing attention to herself. Visitors who saw her during these routines carried their impressions back into their own circles. They repeated what they witnessed directly, a woman who fulfilled her obligations with steady purpose. These first-hand accounts created a counterweight to the stories shaped by her critics. Her demeanor reinforced this image. She interacted with others respectfully, responded to tension with restraint, and avoided escalating conflicts. People who encountered her in these moments found it difficult to reconcile her behavior with the harsher claims surrounding her. Gradually, the version of her created through gossip began to lose its simplicity. Observers could no longer dismiss her as a figure of disorder when they continually saw her acting with composure and intention. Public perception shifted slowly, not through confrontation, but through the accumulation of evidence. Her actions created an alternative narrative for people to consider. This narrative formed not from arguments or emotional defense, but from the routine demonstration of reliability. She recognized that rebuilding her reputation required patience. The stories that damaged her image had grown through repetition. Her efforts needed the same steady momentum. Each gesture, however small, offered observers a chance to reassess their assumptions. She could not control what people chose to believe, but she could give them reasons to question the accuracy of earlier claims. These efforts did not erase the negative interpretations surrounding her, but they weakened their foundation. People who once repeated harsh descriptions of her behavior now hesitated. They remembered moments when she acted with dignity, when she supported those in need, or when she invested in the well-being of the household. These memories softened their willingness to accept new accusations. Her image, though still vulnerable, gained stability through the consistency of her choices. Her steady actions are beginning to provide a counterweight to the harsher stories that once shaped her reputation. Each contribution she makes offers observers a new reference point that complicates earlier assumptions. Changes will start forming as these concrete actions push against the versions of her that others have tried to preserve. Reputation within the household shifted slowly, shaped less by sudden events than by the gradual fading of earlier impressions. People who had once repeated negative claims about their wives found themselves recalling the details with less certainty. Rumors that once felt urgent lost their sharpness as time moved forward. Conversations that had centered on her supposed faults now occurred less frequently. Even those who had been quick to judge felt their earlier certainty diminish. They did not revise their opinions openly, but the intensity with which they held those opinions weakened. The household began adjusting naturally, as though the earlier tension had never been as significant as they claimed. The decline of short-lived rumors reflected a common pattern. Stories that spread quickly often depended on immediate emotion, and emotion rarely sustained itself over extended periods. As the household focused on new concerns, domestic tasks, seasonal obligations, and minor disputes. The exaggerated claims about the wife became harder to maintain. People no longer repeated the stories with the same energy, and the absence of repetition softened their impact. A rumor that had once seemed defining now appeared incomplete, without new incidents to reinforce it. The narrative began losing coherence. Time played a quiet role in reshaping perception. The anger and frustration that had fueled earlier criticisms faded, replaced by the steady routines of daily life. Moments that once provoked judgment were no longer fresh in the minds of those who had witnessed them. Observers who interacted with the wife repeatedly began comparing their memories of the rumors to their current experiences. The contrast between who she was said to be and who she appeared to be in the present created uncertainty. People wondered whether their reactions had been influenced more by household tension than by her actual behavior. This shift did not happen through conscious reconsideration. It happened through the natural erosion of emotion. Over time, people became less invested in the narratives that once defined how they spoke about her. The intensity of past disagreements diminished, and the wife's consistent behavior made the harsher claims surrounding her harder to justify. Even those who disliked her found themselves speaking about her with less hostility. They still remembered the earlier stories, but the emotional charge behind them no longer carried the same weight. Without that charge, the stories felt distant rather than urgent. Patience formed the foundation of this gradual repair. The wife did not attempt to challenge every rumor or confront every misinterpretation. She understood that a direct rebuttal would only draw new attention to the older claims. Instead, she remained steady, allowing her behavior to provide contrast over time. People noticed that she did not repeat the patterns they had been warned about. She did not escalate the conflict. She did not confirm the assumptions that once shaped the discussions about her. This consistency created opportunities for observers to reassess their earlier judgments. Small interactions contributed to this shift. A calm exchange with a relative, a steady response during a tense moment, or a quiet gesture of assistance during a household task. All of these details accumulated in the minds of those around her. None of these interactions was dramatic, yet they created a slow realignment of perception. People who once questioned her stability began noting her reliability. Those who believed she was withdrawn began noticing her presence. These incremental adjustments built a new layer of understanding that replaced the earlier one piece by piece. Her patience also shaped how others chose to speak about her. When they realized that their assumptions no longer matched the woman they interacted with, they adjusted the way they described her in conversation. These adjustments were subtle, choosing a softer word, omitting a harsh detail, or offering a more balanced account of a recent interaction. Over time, these changes created a new narrative. It did not erase the older one, but it covered it with enough detail to make it less significant. People began referring to her with neutrality rather than suspicion, and eventually, with a degree of respect. Reputation in the household now depended less on the dramatic moments of the past and more on the steady behavior they observed in the present. Time had reduced the urgency of earlier claims, and patience had allowed a quieter truth to take form. The wife still lived under scrutiny, but the scrutiny had softened. Observers no longer expected instability. They expected composure. Her measured presence became the new reference point for understanding her character, gradually pushing aside the exaggerated interpretations that once defined her. Her consistency is beginning to outweigh the rumors that shaped early judgments against her. Each passing day reduces the intensity of the claims once used to define her in the household. Shifts will continue forming as people begin re-examining not only her actions, but the voices that interpreted her in the first place. Records of the household, whether formal or informal, rarely reflected the emotional realities of the people living within it. The documents that survived, ledgers, agreements, family accounts, and correspondence between men, focused primarily on matters considered significant by those who held authority. These records shaped the official narrative and excluded the experiences that did not align with the priorities of the time. The wife understood that her life would not be preserved in these accounts, except where it intersected with the interests of men. Her presence appeared only when it supported their stories, not when it reflected her own. Men occupied the central place in these written histories. Their decisions, ambition, and conflicts formed the backbone of the accounts that chronicled the household. Even minor actions taken by the husband were recorded as evidence of leadership or responsibility. His perspective became the lens through which events were interpreted, leaving little space for alternative viewpoints. People who read these accounts later would assume that the husband's narrative represented the full truth. His voice stood unchallenged, not because it was accurate, but because it was the only one granted permanence. In contrast, the emotional lives of women were condensed, simplified, or omitted entirely. Feelings that shaped their daily experiences disappeared from written memory. Any mention of a wife's concerns tended to appear in the margins, framed as reactions rather than experiences. Her patience became a footnote. Her struggles, if acknowledged at all, were described indirectly. Even dramatic shifts in her reputation were recorded only through the actions of others, not through the internal conflict she carried. This reduction created a version of her life that lacked depth, suggesting that her emotions mattered less than the roles she fulfilled. The absence of emotional nuance in official accounts affected how future readers understood her. Without descriptions of her reasoning or context behind her reactions, her decisions appeared abrupt or misguided. When disagreements occurred, chroniclers focused on their impact on the husband rather than on her perspective. As a result, her actions were interpreted through assumptions rather than understanding. The household's written legacy presented her as a figure shaped by other people's choices, rather than as someone who experienced those choices intimately. These distortions became more pronounced when significant conflicts arose. Victors in family disputes or social tensions influenced how events were preserved. People who emerged from these situations with authority dictated which details were emphasized and which were omitted. Their version of events, once written, became the accepted truth. The wife's participation in these moments was minimized, and her emotional involvement disappeared entirely. In some cases, her role was described as secondary, even when she had been directly affected by the decisions made. The narrative favored those whose voices were already dominant. Her reputation within these records reflected the priorities of the people who created them. When chroniclers sought to present the household as orderly, they omitted incidents that suggested internal strain. When they wished to highlight the husband's leadership, they framed the wife's behavior in ways that supported his image. Her identity shifted depending on what reinforced the broader narrative. She was recorded as cooperative when that portrayal benefited the family, and as troublesome when conflict needed an explanation. None of these portrayals captured her lived experience. She carried a quiet awareness that the official version of her life would never match her memories. The moments when she felt unseen, unheard, or misrepresented would not appear in the written accounts. Neither would the internal strength that allowed her to endure repeated distortions of her reputation. She understood that her story existed primarily in the minds of those who witnessed her daily life, and even then, filtered through their own interpretations. Written history preserved certainty, not complexity. Despite knowing that the official record excluded her emotions, she continued fulfilling her responsibilities with steadiness. Her efforts were not for the sake of documentation, but for the sake of those who observed her directly. She recognized that true memory often lived outside of written accounts, carried quietly by people who had seen her navigate the difficulties placed before her. These memories, though fragile, held more truth than anything recorded formally. Her life illustrated how incomplete history could become when shaped solely by those who possessed authority. Her experiences revealed the limits of written narratives that excluded the emotional realities of women. Yet she understood that this imbalance extended beyond her own household. It reflected a broader pattern in which personal emotion, especially that of women, was considered irrelevant to the story deemed worth preserving. Her place in the record is now shaped by voices that never asked how she understood her own life. Each omission narrows the version of her that future generations might recognize. More consequences will unfold as these incomplete accounts become the foundation for judgments she will never be present to correct. Perception of the wife shifted not only across the household, but across time. The version understood by those who lived alongside her differed from the version constructed by the generation that followed. People formed their impressions based on the expectations of the moment, influenced by the values they believed essential to maintaining order. As circumstances changed, so did their interpretations. What seemed unacceptable to one generation became ordinary to the next, and what once drew criticism later appeared justified. The wife's identity existed in this shifting landscape, shaped by observers who carried different assumptions depending on when they encountered her story. Older members of the household judged her through the standards they had inherited. They valued compliance, silence, and predictability. When the wife deviated from these expectations, whether through a firm response, a visible discomfort, or a refusal to accept an unfair judgment, they interpreted her actions as disruptive. These observers believed the purpose of a household was stability, and anything that challenged that stability became a fault. Their evaluation of her behavior reflected the rules they themselves had been taught, rules that emphasized restraint above all else. Younger members, however, viewed the same actions differently. They grew up in a period where emotional expression held greater acceptance and where disagreements were not automatically seen as disorder. When they witnessed the wife pushing back gently against misrepresentation, they interpreted it as reasonable rather than rebellious. When she maintained her dignity in the face of criticism, they saw endurance rather than passivity. These observers questioned the severity of earlier judgments, recognizing inconsistencies between the stories they had been told and the woman they saw before them. Their interpretations softened descriptions that had once been harsh. Morality also shifted across generations. Standards that once placed narrow expectations on women began to widen. Qualities that were previously criticized, such as assertiveness or emotional clarity, slowly gained recognition as strengths. People who inherited the older narrative about the wife found themselves reconsidering parts of it when placed within a modern context. The judgments that once seemed justified appeared excessive when examined with distance. As social expectations changed, so did the willingness to accept that the wife's struggles reflected the constraints placed upon her, rather than personal inadequacy. This shift affected how family stories were retold. Older members emphasized conflict, misinterpretation, and the supposed instability of the wife. Younger members added details omitted from earlier accounts, acknowledging pressures that previous storytellers had ignored. They began to describe her as someone who faced expectations too rigid to accommodate her reality. These additions did not erase the earlier narrative, but they complicated it. Her story expanded in ways that made it harder to dismiss her as the figure the first generation had portrayed. Over time, the distance between these interpretations grew clearer. The first generation remembered the wife as someone whose presence contributed to household tension. The second generation remembered her as someone navigating the weight of expectations placed unfairly upon her. Neither version captured her completely, but the contrast revealed how much judgment depended on the values of the observer. People began to see that the earlier accusations had reflected the priorities of the time, not necessarily the truth of her character. As the years passed, some of the harsher claims made against her faded into ambiguity. People who once described her with certainty now admitted that they could not recall exact details. Those who had repeated criticism softened their language, acknowledging that memory had altered the sharpness of the events. Her reputation, once fragile, gained new resilience simply because the emotional charge behind the earlier stories no longer held the same strength. Distance made space for fairness that had not existed when tensions were at their height. This gradual re-evaluation opened the possibility of restoring parts of her image. People who had once dismissed her began acknowledging the constraints she had lived under. They recognized that many of her actions reflected defense rather than aggression, endurance rather than weakness. Some even described her with sympathy, admitting that they had overlooked her difficulties. These later evaluations did not fully reverse the harm done to her reputation, but they offered a form of retrospective balance that had never been granted during her lifetime. Her story revealed how reputation could change dramatically when viewed through different generational lenses. It demonstrated that judgment depended on the values used to interpret behavior rather than on the behavior itself. By the time the second generation formed its own conclusions, the wife had become someone more complex, more human, and less defined by the fears or expectations of the past. Her identity is no longer confined to the version constructed by those who judged her most harshly. Each retelling by the next generation opens space for interpretations grounded in context rather than assumption. Further shifts will unfold as her story becomes part of a broader reflection on how women were treated within households shaped by rigid expectations. The wife understood that the story circulating about her did not match the person she recognized in her own private thoughts. The descriptions repeated in the household and carried into the wider community were shaped by selective memory, shifting loyalties, and the assumptions of those who held authority. Yet fragments of her own voice still survived in the places where she had been allowed to speak without interruption. These fragments offered a contrast to the accounts built around her by others. They demonstrated that she possessed an identity independent of the narratives imposed upon her. Private letters revealed parts of her that the household rarely acknowledged. In her careful handwriting, she expressed concerns that did not appear in public conversations. She described her attempts to maintain order, her quiet frustrations, and her efforts to preserve a sense of dignity under pressure. These letters did not dramatize her experiences. They documented them plainly, with an honesty she withheld in daily interactions. People who read them later saw a different woman, not the figure shaped by rumor, but someone navigating responsibilities that exceeded the recognition she received. The letters served as evidence that her lived reality diverged sharply from the narratives that others constructed around her. These written traces also conveyed her reasoning. She explained decisions that observers once dismissed as impulsive or misguided. Through her own explanations, the logic behind her actions became clear. She had responded to pressures invisible to those who judged her and balanced expectations that contradicted one another, while chroniclers often framed her choices as emotional or unpredictable. Her letters showed deliberation and restraint. They demonstrated that she acted with intention, even when others attributed her behavior to weakness or instability. Beyond her private correspondence, the wife's everyday conduct revealed aspects of her character that could not be captured in formal accounts. Her routine actions, small gestures performed without an audience, reflected a steadiness that outsiders rarely recognized. She attended to responsibilities that kept the household functioning, maintained relationships quietly, and offered assistance where she believed it necessary. These habits were not acts designed to influence public opinion. They were simply expressions of who she was. Observers who noticed these patterns saw a woman who carried herself with consistency even when her reputation fluctuated. Her presence during moments of ordinary life also held significance. She moved through the household with a measured pace, neither rushed nor withdrawn. She interacted with servants in tones that revealed neither superiority nor fear. Her responses to unexpected situations were calm, even when the atmosphere around her carried tension. None of these details appeared in the stories told about her, yet they provided the truest representation of her daily existence. They showed how much of her character remained overshadowed by public interpretation. These quiet behaviors formed a counterweight to the narratives that shaped her reputation. While rumors reduced her identity to a collection of accusations and assumptions, her actions reflected a consistent moral center. People who spent time observing her without preconceived views began to acknowledge the contrast. They noticed that what was said about her often did not align with what they saw. For some, this recognition came slowly. For others, it arrived abruptly when they realized the distance between the spoken narrative and the lived reality. Her ability to influence her own story remained limited. The dominant voices within the household still controlled the accounts that circulated widely. Yet, she was not entirely powerless. Her letters, her daily actions, and the impressions she left on quieter observers built a foundation that resisted complete erasure. These elements did not replace the official narratives, but they challenged their authority. They offered future readers the possibility of reassessment, allowing a more balanced understanding to emerge. Her story demonstrated that reputation was not a fixed outcome. It could be revised, reconsidered, and reinterpreted as new evidence appeared. The wife's private expressions and steady behavior undermined the certainty with which earlier judgments had been made. People who encountered these traces began to understand that her identity had been shaped by circumstances more than by choice. They recognized that her reputation reflected the biases of those who spoke about her, rather than the truth she carried. The persistence of her own voice, however limited, ensured that she would not be defined solely by stories crafted without her input. It reminded later generations that every individual possesses a perspective that deserves acknowledgement, even when excluded from formal accounts. Her attempt to claim a part of her narrative, though modest, shifted the balance enough to reveal the flaws in the earlier portrayals. Each version carries an absence that cannot be ignored. Each truth settles only where the listener chooses to let it rest. Each conclusion belongs less to the speaker and more to the one who hears it. The household carried two versions of the same events, and neither version matched completely. People repeated what they had heard, but each repetition carried a different intention, shaped by the person who delivered it and the audience who received it. The wife understood that once a story split into two voices, the path toward clarity narrowed until only fragments remained visible. No explanation, no correction, and no attempt at justification could merge the two versions again. They drifted apart slowly, forming separate interpretations that continued to grow even when the events themselves had already faded. Each version lacked pieces that would have made the story whole. The husband spoke from a position shaped by expectation and authority, presenting his choices as reasonable decisions necessary for the stability of the household. He omitted the uncertainty that had guided him and the emotional strain that had influenced his judgment. He described the wife's responses as reactions rather than experiences, leaving out the context that had shaped her behavior. His version held confidence but not depth. The wife's voice emerged more quietly, formed through letters, small explanations, and conversations that did not carry beyond the private spaces where they were spoken. She did not present her story as an argument. She simply expressed what had happened from her perspective. But her words lacked the force that public narratives required. She included details that others dismissed as irrelevant, and she avoided presenting herself as someone who had been wronged. As a result, parts of her version appeared incomplete, not because they lacked truth, but because they lacked the structure that made stories persuasive to those who listened casually. Between these two accounts lay a space filled with details neither side mentioned. Some of these details were forgotten, others were removed intentionally because they complicated the narrative. People later searching for a definitive truth encountered only the remnants of what had once been a fuller story. They discovered that the more they tried to combine the two accounts, the more they revealed contradictions that could not be resolved. The wife and the husband had experienced the same events, yet had lived them differently. Their memories had diverged long before their stories had. Listeners, not speakers, shaped how the story settled in the end. The household chose which version aligned better with its sense of order. Some favored the husband's account because it confirmed their assumptions and protected the structure they relied on. Others, observing the wife's quiet endurance, accepted her version despite its lack of authority. Still others blended the two without examining either. selecting pieces that formed a comfortable narrative rather than an accurate one. The outcome depended less on what was said and more on what people wished to believe. The presence of two competing narratives created uncertainty that spread slowly into the broader community. Neighbours repeated what they had heard, adjusting their retellings based on whom they sympathised with. Servants carried fragments from one room to another, unaware of how their limited perspective influenced the shape of the story. Younger relatives, removed from the original conflict, accepted whatever version had been repeated most often in their presence. Over time, the story gained stability, not through evidence but through repetition. The wife felt the weight of this fragmentation more than anyone else. She recognized that the version of her that survived would not be entirely hers. It would be shaped by others, interpreted by listeners, and carried forward by people who had never spoken to her directly. Her attempts to express her own perspective were necessary but insufficient. Once, a second voice emerged. Her story was no longer solely her own. It became a shared object subject to interpretation, adjustment, and selective preservation. Even so, she continued to speak in the ways available to her. She wrote letters that revealed her internal reasoning. She maintained behaviors that reflected her integrity even when misinterpreted. She accepted that she could not control the full narrative, but refused to erase herself from it. Her quiet persistence ensured that her voice remained present, even if it never became dominant. The existence of two voices did not guarantee fairness. It only ensured complexity. Truth became a shifting line, drawn differently by every person who engaged with the story. Each listener shaped it according to their experiences, beliefs, and assumptions. The household carried these interpretations forward, layering judgments across time until the original events became nearly impossible to separate from the stories built upon them. Each version reveals what it chooses and conceals what it cannot hold. Each listener shapes the truth into something that fits their own understanding. More layers will form as the story continues, moving through voices that were never part of the original events. Modern readers approaching the wife's story do not carry the same expectations that once shaped earlier judgments. They examine motives rather than accepting conclusions, and they seek context rather than relying on fragments passed down without question. The distance created by time allows a clearer view of pressures that had been invisible to those who lived within the household. The wife's experiences can now be interpreted with attention to the circumstances that shaped her behavior, rather than measured against the narrow expectations of a society that required quiet acceptance. This shift creates room for a more balanced understanding, one that earlier generations never permitted. A modern evaluation begins with the question of motive. Earlier accounts framed the wife's actions as emotional reactions, lacking reason or stability. They separated her decisions from the environment that produced them, allowing observers to reduce her identity to isolated moments. Contemporary analysis resists that simplification. It considers why she responded as she did, what constraints influenced her choices, and how her position within the household restricted her autonomy. Instead of asking whether she behaved correctly, the modern reader asks, what options were genuinely available to her? This shift changes the entire structure of interpretation. It moves judgment away from personal blame and toward an understanding of systemic limits. Many of the wife's decisions, once labeled unreasonable, appear different when examined through this approach. Her caution reflects a calculation shaped by risk. Her hesitations reveal the weight of responsibility placed on her by marriage, family expectations, and social scrutiny. Her attempts to maintain order show a commitment to stability rather than a fear of conflict. Modern readers recognize these nuances because they analyze intention rather than outcome. This perspective grants the wife a depth that earlier narratives denied her. Context also becomes essential in reconstructing her reputation. The events recorded in the household cannot be evaluated without understanding the broader environment in which they occurred. The rules of Tudor society, the expectations placed on wives, and the norms that governed reputation all shaped the constraints she lived within. Actions that seemed excessive or misguided, through the lens of her contemporaries, appear far more measured when placed against these pressures. Modern readers understand that emotional restraint was demanded of her. Public image dictated her survival, and silence often protected her more effectively than confrontation. Judgments made without acknowledging these conditions are incomplete. Understanding context requires examining the power structures surrounding her. The wife functioned within a hierarchy where her authority was simultaneously recognized and limited. She possessed formal status, but lacked full control. People above her influenced how events were interpreted, and people below her carried fragments of her private life into the broader household. Her reputation depended not only on what she did, but also on how others presented her. When modern readers consider this dynamic, they see how fragile her position truly was. They recognize that her actions reflected both personal intention and imposed constraint. This recognition leads to a re-evaluation of her role as a woman within a rigid social framework. Modern perspectives acknowledge that women's contributions were often minimized, their agency overlooked, and their experiences simplified to fit narratives shaped by men. The wife's story becomes an example of how women's roles were both central and obscured. Though she influenced the household's daily functioning, her story survived only in fragments filtered through other people's voices. Contemporary readers identify this pattern as a structural issue rather than a personal failing. They understand that women were expected to maintain order without receiving credit and to endure pressure without public acknowledgement. Reassessing her place within these structures shifts the interpretation of her entire life. Rather than being seen solely as a participant in domestic conflict, she becomes a figure navigating complex layers of expectation, responsibility, and surveillance. Her endurance reflects not resignation but strategic adaptation. Her silence reflects not weakness but calculation. Her persistence in maintaining her duties reveals a commitment to stability that earlier accounts ignored. Modern readers view these actions as evidence of strength rather than deficiency. This reinterpretation does not erase the difficulties she experienced, nor does it transform her into a heroic figure. Instead, it restores balance to the record. It acknowledges the complexity of her circumstances and the limitations that shaped her decisions. It examines her life with an understanding that earlier observers lacked. Through this lens, her reputation is neither dismissed nor defended blindly. It is understood. A modern reading does more than correct the past. It highlights how interpretations evolve and how stories shift when new frameworks are applied. The wife's life becomes a reminder that history is not fixed, but continually re-examined. Her story gains dimension, not because new facts emerge, but because modern readers are willing to look beyond the assumptions that once defined her. Her reputation changes when motives are examined instead of presumed. Her story expands when context is restored to the events that shaped it. More revisions will emerge as future readers continue questioning the limits of earlier narratives. History did not remain fixed once people began to examine it with greater distance. The story that once appeared straightforward became a subject of discussion, reconsideration, and quiet disagreement. The wife, who had been judged through a narrow lens in her own time, became a figure analysed from multiple directions. Her reputation no longer depended solely on the accounts that survived from those who held authority. It shifted as more people questioned how the earlier narrative had been formed. This transition marked the moment when history stopped being a single voice and started becoming a conversation. The earlier version of events had relied heavily on one-sided descriptions. Chroniclers presented their interpretations as certainty, leaving no space for alternative perspectives. Their accounts lacked nuance because they assumed that authority granted them accuracy. Once modern readers challenged this assumption, the narrative loosened. People realized that a story told from one direction could not fully capture the complexity of what had happened. Observers began asking who had shaped the narrative, what they had chosen to include, and what they had chosen to leave out. This shift revealed that the earlier story had always been incomplete. As more sources emerged, the single narrative fractured into multiple viewpoints. Private letters, forgotten notes, and accounts from individuals who once seemed peripheral began offering additional context. These materials did not replace the official records, but they challenged the clarity those records claimed to possess. Each new source added details that forced readers to reconsider earlier judgments. Some revealed the wife's internal reasoning. Others exposed the quiet tensions within the household that the public story had avoided. The accumulation of these small pieces formed a more layered picture than the original authors had intended. Comparing these different sources required patience and a willingness to accept ambiguity. Readers recognized that no single account could be trusted entirely. They began to treat each document as one perspective rather than a complete truth. This approach allowed contradictions to exist without forcing a single explanation. In some places, the accounts aligned. In others, they pointed in opposite directions. Instead of choosing one version to embrace, readers acknowledged the possibility that both versions contained parts of the truth. This method reflected a modern understanding of history as a collection of viewpoints rather than a singular authority. The wife's story benefited from this expanded approach. Earlier judgments had relied heavily on descriptions that lacked fairness. Her emotions had been dismissed. Her intentions had been simplified. Her actions had been interpreted through the expectations of those around her. When compared with newer sources, these interpretations began to weaken. Readers saw that her decisions made sense when viewed within the pressures she faced. They noted inconsistencies in the criticisms leveled against her. They recognized that her supposed failings often reflected the limitations of her environment rather than deficiencies in her character. As the conversation around her history widened, so did the understanding of the structures that had shaped her life. Readers acknowledged that Tudor society had created conditions in which women's reputations could be altered easily by rumor, misinterpretation, or simple misunderstanding. They noted how authority influenced which narratives were preserved and which were ignored. They examined how the household's internal tensions contributed to the way the wife had been judged. This broader perspective shifted attention away from personal blame and toward an examination of the systems that shaped her circumstances. A fairer assessment emerged, not because the wife's story became more flattering, but because it became more complete. The new conversation recognized her complexity, her limitations, and her quiet resilience. It allowed readers to see her as someone navigating difficult conditions, rather than as a figure defined by accusation. Her reputation became subject to evaluation rather than acceptance. People approached her story with an understanding that earlier observers had lacked. They saw her not only through the judgments imposed on her, but through the details that had previously remained hidden. This change did not erase the earlier narrative. It existed alongside the newer interpretations, revealing how history evolves through reconsideration. The wife's story became an example of how reputations shift when examined with care. The conversation surrounding her continued to grow as more readers brought their own perspectives to the material. Each contribution altered the boundaries of the narrative slightly, ensuring that her story would never again be restricted to a single version. The move from a one-directional narrative to a multifaceted dialogue demonstrated how fragile historical certainty could be. It also showed how necessary it was to question what had been accepted for so long. Through this process, the wife gained a form of recognition that had been unavailable to her in life. Her story became part of an ongoing exchange that valued understanding over judgment. Her life becomes clearer when multiple sources are allowed to shape the narrative. Her reputation gains balance when comparison replaces assumption. Further voices will continue reshaping her story as history expands beyond its original limits. The wife was never just the version people constructed around her. Her reputation, once shaped through fragments and assumptions, could change when examined with greater distance. History, however slow and however incomplete, always waited for another voice to step forward. These three truths formed the quiet frame around the end of her story. even though she never knew how many interpretations would follow her into the years beyond the household. There were moments when she felt the gap between who she was and who others believed her to be. She noticed it in the way conversations shifted abruptly when she entered the room, in the careful politeness people adopted, and in the repeating patterns of judgment she could not trace back to a single event. Her life had become something discussed rather than understood. She moved through the household with steady restraint, aware that her smallest actions tended to appear in stories that travelled farther than she intended. Yet she continued her days with composure, not because she accepted the narrative forced upon her, but because she refused to let it remove her sense of self. As time passed, she learned that silence did not protect her entirely. People interpreted her quietness according to their own assumptions. Some saw dignity, others saw weakness. A few saw only the version that best fit the story they wanted to maintain. She remained a constant presence, yet her identity shifted depending on who spoke about her. This realization did not bring anger. It brought a colder understanding. Her life inside the household depended as much on other people's words as on her own behavior. Her days reflected a balance she had to keep, knowing that each moment could drift toward misinterpretation without her consent. Those who lived around her contributed to the layering of her story. The husband's voice carried weight because the structure of the household granted him authority. Servants contributed fragments through the details they observed without context. Relatives passed stories through their own intentions, either protecting the family's image or adjusting it to widen their influence. These layers shaped a narrative that often moved ahead of the truth. The wife recognized this pattern and understood she could not dismantle it fully. She could only continue living in a way that left traces strong enough to challenge the least accurate versions of her story. In private, she maintained small routines that anchored her within the shifting perceptions. She wrote letters, not to justify herself, but to record her thoughts before they slipped into silence. She paid attention to tasks that kept the household stable. She interacted with those around her with the same measured calm, regardless of their changing opinions. These quiet actions, though overlooked by most, helped preserve parts of her identity that no rumor could fully erase. They allowed her to remain connected to the simplest parts of her daily life, the parts not shaped by commentary. The years gradually softened the household's certainty about her. Memories blurred, and earlier accusations no longer carried the same force. Younger family members grew curious about the gaps in the older stories. They saw inconsistencies that earlier generations had ignored. They asked questions about events that no longer seemed as clear as they once had. Through their interest, the wife's reputation began to shift. Her story opened to interpretations that offered balance rather than dependence on a single voice. Modern readers encountered her through these fragments and noticed how much had been left out. They saw a woman navigating responsibilities, expectations, and scrutiny that shaped her life more intensely than the accounts had acknowledged. Her endurance appeared less like submission and more like a deliberate decision to maintain stability where she could. Her silence became something layered rather than empty. Modern readers noticed that the household had rarely asked what she felt or how she understood the events around her. They realized that her story had always deserved more than the limited judgments written about her. With distance, history became less rigid. The wife's life turned into a conversation rather than a fixed account. Readers compared contradictory sources and allowed multiple perspectives to exist at once. They recognized the structural limitations women faced and how reputations were shaped by forces outside their control. They saw that her lack of visible resistance did not imply absence of thought, and that her quiet persistence carried weight ignored by those who documented her life. As these interpretations accumulated, the wife's legacy settled into a more measured form. She remained neither perfect nor flawed beyond repair. She became a person shaped by her environment, her pressures, her roles, and her limited choices. Her actions, once used to justify speculation, appeared more coherent when placed within the context of her responsibilities. Her reputation, once unstable, grew steadier through understanding rather than assumption. Even so, her story did not resolve into a single conclusion. It continued to shift with each retelling because new readers approached it with their own questions. Some found sympathy in her endurance. Others focused on the constraints she lived under. A few examined the broader structure of Tudor households and used her life as a quiet example of how women navigated systems not designed to protect them. Each interpretation added to her legacy without claiming to replace earlier versions entirely. Her story, once controlled by others, found its balance through time. It no longer belonged to a single voice or a single perspective. It became something larger, an accumulation of observations, reconsiderations, and fragments that would continue to shift as long as people returned to examine it. The wife, who once moved through her days unnoticed, except when someone chose to comment on her, became a figure shaped by dialogue rather than silence. She is no longer only the image others assign to her. She becomes clearer each time her story is re-examined with patience. History will wait for whoever chooses to tell her life with the care it once lacked. And now, as this story settles into its final quiet shape, I hope your night softens with it. May the stillness around you feel steady, and may the voices in this tale fade gently into the dark. Sleep well, and let the weight of these old rooms drift away from you.